Let's start with kind of like reminding listeners, right? Like
Okay.
what was going on. So like January 18th, right?
Yes.
That was the church protest.
Yes.
Okay. So Operation Metro Surge
Yes.
going strong.
Yes.
Bovino is here.
Yes.
Tensions are high. With your legal background,
Yes.
what can you say about the legality of the protest?
So there is a rich tradition of civil disobedience in this country, of intentionally setting out to protest in a way that breaks the law to show the immorality of the law. My understanding in that day was that I wasn't doing anything illegal, and you could see that in my interview with Don Lemon, where I publicly spoke to the fact that it's important to show up and to be in community, and for folks who are seeking office, in my opinion, for the first time, folks should seek to be inside the lines of the law, and that was my impression of the action that we were taking.
Let's talk about like what happened in the days after the protest.
Yes.
So Nikema, civil rights activist, lawyer, is arrested.
Yes.
Chantel Allen, school board member in St. Paul, arrested.
Yes.
At that point, there was talk about specifically like Don Lemon,
Yes.
right, being arrested and
Yes.
all of that litigation, and then not charging him and then charging him.
Yes.
So walk me through like your personal experience in that time between the protest and then when you met legal
Yes.
action, law
Absolutely.
enforcement.
And so when I heard of the arrest that occurred with Nikema and Chantel Allen, let's just say after the events, obviously I was aware of a big kerfuffle, statements out of the White House that were, at least to me, seemed to be, acting as if this was an aberration, as if, for instance, the president, Joe Biden, was protested at AME Church. And, the statements didn't seem to comport with kind of the rich history of direct action in and around sacred spaces. Seeing that occur and then seeing threats to arrest the people who participated obviously caused me some concern. And then when I saw Nikema and Chantel actually being arrested, then around that time, really around the time that the threats started materializing, I reached out to folks for legal counsel. I wanted to ensure that I was protected, but most importantly, I wanted to have a line of communication to the U.S. Attorney's Office to inquire around, whether or not there would be arrest warrants, what was the legal status, and what were they concretely looking to actually do. I eventually retained the counsel that I currently have. That was following that arrest, in which case we spent a significant amount of time and effort reaching out to the U.S. Attorney's, U.S. Marshal's office. We were told at the time that there was not an arrest warrant. If folks know, I'm seeking public office, and so I'm out and about in public at all times. My wife is an elected member of the St. Paul City Council, and so as you can imagine, if there were an arrest warrant issued, then I ain't hard to find, and I certainly would be willing to cooperate with authorities in terms of turning myself in. And so, it was a very surprising transition to when, I saw a team of, I think, up to about 10 folks, a SWAT team essentially on my front lawn from the federal government. Yeah.
Yes, we are going to get to that
Yes.
portion. Can you kind of go into however much you can about your like relationship with this group of people?
Yes.
Like why you're all kind of grouped together?
So, to the extent I can, partly as I've expressed before, that unfortunately I can't get into the details of the actual events of that day based on the advice of counsel. However, I will say that I've known Chantel Allen for a very long time. She's a school board member and a leader in our community in St. Paul. Nakima is well renowned, but obviously she's been working on the front lines of advocating around issues like police reform. That's issues for which I worked on in terms of my history in the legislature at the Minnesota House of Representatives in the Public Safety Committee under Chair Carlos Mariani. And so I've had to have those relationships for a long period of time, as she was a former leader of the Minneapolis NAACP, and afterwards also was a very strong community voice. Another individual that was charged, Jerome Treadwell, is I always kind of think about my little brother. We see each other in passing quite often. He works within and around St. Paul, advocates for the Rondo community, and so as you can imagine, like folks in your neighborhood, you have a good passing relationship with it, with each other, and so there was so we all, to some extent, folks there knew each other. We're not part of an organization per se. Trahan Cruz leads our operations committee over in St. Paul, which is housed under the St. Paul City Council, and so the individuals who were charged, we all have some tangential connection through our work on advocating for civil and human rights. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
Off the record,
yes.
When I was just reading the complaint, it's kind of, I don't know, the wording that they use to describe you guys. I'm like, wait, I know him from way back. That doesn't sound right. I'll just say that they have very animated descriptions in this charge, and I don't want to characterize it further, but let's just say that I have disagreements with what they're alleging here. Fair. Okay, let's go into the morning of your arrest. You said the SWAT team came. Yes. Let's kind of dive into that. So
in the morning of my arrest, I was actually upstairs. My wife fell asleep on the couch. Sometimes you know how that is, where you trying to. She basically was knocked out on the couch, and I'm like, "Come upstairs, babe." Now she's like, "I'm not sleeping. I'm not going to fall asleep on the couch anymore." Last time, so I was upstairs sleeping, and then she, sleep down there. She was actually busy working the night before, and so I went up to bed, and she ended up falling asleep there, and so she was woken up by, banging on our door, and.
What time is this?
This is around late, 5:45, 6, about around that time. And the banging on the door, she was really startled and confused. Got up and saw an individual, law enforcement officer, and then threatening to break down the door with a large, what I believe to be an AR-15, something of that size. And with a number of individuals behind them on my lawn, and basically yelling and threatening, forcible entry into the house, and stating that they know Jamael is here, and with a lot of you would think it'd be a drug raid or something of that nature, and she did the right thing, did the brave thing of refusing to open the door until they presented a warrant. We have a glass door, so you can just see directly there, which makes all of the theatrics less and less necessary. And once they presented the warrant, she ensured that it was signed. At that point, I was listening to what was occurring downstairs, partly because ICE has lost its credibility, and DHS as well has lost every ounce of credibility. They have entered folks' houses without permission. They have, at least there have been reports of them doing so. There's been reports of them just entering folks' residence, using these sheets of paper, ain't worth nothing, like you call it administrative warrants. There's been a lot of terror and harm inflicted on our community. And for that reason, I didn't want to present myself, give them a reason to, break down the door or anything of that nature until we were aware that there was a firm judicial warrant. And when she did essentially indicate verbally, oh, that's a warrant or something of that nature, when I heard the knocking already, I proceeded to actually get dressed as quickly as possible. Because again, there were reports of them dragging people out half naked. There were, and my interpretation of the events from the threats that came out of the White House in terms of we will be issuing arrest warrants and so forth, was that the intent was to embarrass, humiliate, and intimidate those who were participating. And so part of my effort in first getting dressed and everything was to deny them that pleasure, for lack of a better sense, or really that political propaganda. Threw on some clothes as quickly as possible. As soon as I heard that there was actually a warrant, I told my wife I'm coming down, let them know I'll be right down. I headed downstairs, and obviously kissed my wife, let them know, hey, we just follow a plan. Because before that time we talked through, and out of an abundance of caution and out of just what I felt was the appropriate thing as a political candidate. I wasn't, there are numerous amounts of protest and direct action numerous folks, including myself, have taken part of since this ICE occupation has occurred. From the evening following the murder of Renee Good, the killing of Renee Good, however folks want to phrase that, not a technical finding, but a moral finding. I've been out to the scene, paid my respects, been out in protest in a number of different ways. That day was another protest. And I didn't feel it was appropriate to make my campaign about one day, one protest, one action. And so if folks can see my social media and see my actions that followed, there's a number of, I continue to stay focused on community, showing up to mutual aid drives from Representative Maria Issa, continuing to be part of our Black History program, leading with our Black Ministerial Alliance, being deeply involved in that community work. And what I told my wife, though, was if I am arrested, this is something that we must speak to, we must stand on. My wife is a very powerful organizer, a powerful speaker. She's a former vice president of the NAACP. She has a lot of strong grassroots connections. And so what I told her was just follow that plan is, at this point it's time to really speak out. It's time to really, marshal folks together. Since Nakima's arrest, I spoke out against that consistently and consistently said this is an attack on free speech. There's a lot of folks who like to debate tactics of protest, as we always do, but ultimately the one thing that I think most folks can agree on is the tactics of the protest pale in comparison to the tactics of the government in terms of the concern and how problematic what the government's actually looking to do, particularly in light of our First Amendment protections to express dissent. And so that morning, after kissing my wife, after being fully dressed, putting my shoes on, they were threatening to trying to break down the door as I put my shoe on. And I'm like, guys, we're gonna be all right.
Was this sorry to interrupt you? Is this this is federal agents?
Yes,
federal officers?
This is federal agents. What I remember was DHS. I think an individual from the FBI, and then I think even the DEA was there for some reason, right? And so one thing I didn't want to do is grant them access to my home because, again, I think part of the impulse there was to embarrass, intimidate, and I didn't want them to wreck my house. And so what I did was immediately step outside on the front porch, had a discussion with them, and what I saw was, if it wasn't so heavy and serious with folks with guns, pointing at your wife, a SWAT team at your house after already saying you would turn yourself in, it's farcical. It would be, last night I made some public comments around, we need to give people permission to laugh at the ridiculousness of this regime. I mean, you're out in, urban area in St. Paul with full camouflage on. You got folks with guns drawn at a house that your attorney earlier in the week said, hey, just let us know if there's an arrest warrant. We'll come right in. You got 2 people on camera duty. If this is such a SWAT team operation, you're using manpower to just hold up a camera phone. It was just so clearly and transparently political theater to the point where even the federal agents had to kind of laugh at themselves I'm like, is all this really necessary? And again, it would be funny if we in Minnesota didn't just recently see assassinations on elected officials from individuals impersonating law enforcement. And so to kind of put everyone in that scenario, in that danger, by instead of taking the most precautious and safe approach, doing a security assessment, and obviously have, no history of violence really in my life, to put their own people at risk in that way, not to understand the scenario that elected officials just last summer, had a unspeakable tragedy. And I was close to Melissa Hortman. I worked on her campaign in 2014. She was a close mentor of mine. And so it really impacted my wife and I, and I did heighten our security measures. And so it could have been something that unfolded that could have been much more disastrous. And so for me, it just heightens, just the depravity of what this administration's after, scoring political points at any means, putting people's lives at risk, even if they're the folks who they employ, looking to intimidate people just for speaking out. And then in the light of that, at the same time, there really are folks who've killed Alex Preddy and Renee Good, and initially there was no cooperation, even looking at investigating them, let alone arrest made. And this disproportionate partisan, application of law is, we got to call it like it is what it is: fascism. It is the rule of the strong looking to intimidate folks into following in the line, not a rule of justice. So that morning was really an indication of that. And, during the arrest, I essentially, I won't go into too much details around it, but, essentially made light of the officers' efforts to them. One, to de-escalate the situation. Two, to provide my wife some comfort that, I'm going to be all right. But three, to, give a mirror to their own actions, for them to understand they're a part of something really ugly, and that they had full autonomy to always step away. And I always am reminded of, one of my history teachers who talks about the fact that he did a, civil rights tour, and he's from Alabama, and he was saying that, this individual in Georgia, his name escapes me, but there was no one, you can't find someone who worked for the sheriff's department in the 60s in Alabama. That's because they're all ashamed of what they did, what they participated in. And I believe that's what we're going to be seeing with a lot of these individuals who signed up for DHS. Maybe some signed up for good reasons. Maybe some are long-term officers who were looking for, just ways to crack down on people who actually were, criminals in our nation who've done heinous things. But what we've seen this drift into is a power grab, a play for more power, to suppress folks who may disagree, to ensure that, basically division and hate rules the day so that they can divide up this nation enough to extract money from all of us, to be honest. And so, I can go deeper into some of that discussion, but that morning really struck a nerve with me and my wife, because, it really, a lot of what we talk about and what we protest against showed up on our front door.
How many days was it before you were arrested after Nikema and Chantel were arrested?
I think it was about a week or so from what I remember, right? I think they were arrested that previous Thursday or Wednesday or Thursday, and then about a week and a half passed. And then I was arrested that following Friday, from what I understand. And coincidentally, the same day where Friday News dumped the Epstein files, just purely a coincidence, right? They arrested a celebrated reporter, and Don Lemon, nationally known, also with treasurer of our state, Georgia Fort, arrested an activist and arrested a politician in a brazen disregard for the First Amendment or the repeated orders of judges who in many of those cases refused to grant a warrant, which is, very, very rare if you actually have a solid case or a really solid reason to pursue an arrest warrant. And so, that timing seemed, very coincidental, I'll put it that way, very circumspect.
Mm-hmm. So you're arrested, you're taken into custody by federal agents. What happens next? Where do they take you? So
I'm arrested. I am, handcuffed. I believe that's federal procedure, but again, completely unnecessary. We are brought to the Whipple building. In the Whipple building, let's put it this way. What you see there is the banality of evil. You see a industrialized processing plant for people, and it is truly disturbing. You see a cross-section of America there in many ways, which folks may suspect, it's all like skinheads, but no, it's soccer moms and, folks who are of all different races and backgrounds, laughing over cups of coffee as if they are, working at, was it Dunder Mifflin, right? But no, they are processing bodies, and they're oftentimes processing bodies of individuals with no criminal offense. And the majority of those who've been arrested by ICE, the administration themselves state that. And so you are, and so walking through the area where you kind of get searched and do the entry point, there were a number of individuals, sitting there watching, kind of casually talking, and I really took issue with that. I took issue with their participation, and specifically at the time, at the height of Operation Metro Surge, was, and this was at that time after the murder of Alex Preddy, that basically, well, you're still here and you're still working in this space. I reminded them that they had agency, that which I think is really important for folks to appreciate and understand, that I don't think we should make practice of condemning people's or entire existence based on their profession or individual decisions they make. I believe everyone is worthy of redemption. However, taking accountability and not participating in the evils of our world, and Operation Metro Surge was an evil visited upon our state. It's, needless to say, if someone's, watching the news, they probably have a very strong appreciation for the untold lives that it impacted, the incredible economic devastation it laid bare, the confidence it shook in our government institution, the betrayal people feel at the federal government that's supposed to protect and provide for them, that was focused on terrorizing them. And to be a part of that machinery, to be laughing and joking while that machinery was humming at its heights, to see people murdered without retribution, without any accountability, and to continue to show up every day and punch the clock, it was extremely disturbing to me, and so that's partly what I let those folks know, is that you have a choice. This is shameful. I contacted you all for this arrest. You're a part of a political machinery, and their reaction to me stating that was to cover their face, right? And not cover their face in anger, but cover their face, and not in concern and fear, but just in shame. They all got very quiet, because not someone was saying you're terrible people, but someone saying you're capable of being good. You're capable of do you need a paycheck this bad? Reminding them that, hey, there's a whole concentration camps couldn't run without soccer moms just like yourself, right? Japanese internment camps couldn't run without folks showing up punching the clock. It was the manpower, the organizational capacity that allowed for these organizations to run. If you think back to the Klan, right? The Klan existed for at its height for over 100 years, from the fall of the end of the Civil War to the height of the Civil Rights Movement, and even into the 70s and 80s. The organization was eventually crippled due to social stigma. Now, and a number of lawsuits as well based upon their illegal actions. But at its height in the early 20th century, people kind of have forgotten that the Klan was accepted in polite society. The Klan was the leader of banks and Rotary clubs, and they were the leader of churches, right? They were the superheroes in the nation's biggest movie, Birth of a Nation. You go watch it, they're the Avengers. They come in to save the day. The Klan. The Klan was invited to the White House for a screening, right, to applause from our president at the time, Woodrow Wilson, right? This is our history. And I think people believe that the Klan was driven out of polite society because one day people just woke up and said, you know what, these guys are kind of racist, right? They are lynching people and breaking the law. It's probably not a good thing that they should be the head of our bank, head of our church, the head of our, Rotary clubs, right? It was due to direct action from organizations like the NAACP that protested, that showed up, that shamed the individuals affiliated with that organization or individuals affiliated with individuals who were in that organization, right? That creation of that social stigma is what crippled that Klan, is what drove them out of polite society. And so I believe that when you go through Whipple and you talk with folks in and around folks who are involved with ICE, it's extremely important that we recognize that that institution that's violated over 100 court orders, core constitutional concepts like habeas corpus, which folks may not know the fancy Latin, which means something along the lines of "bring me the body," right? Is show the defendant in court. They violate that over 100. The district court judges are sounding the alarm about this. This institution, they say, violated more court orders in a few months than most agencies have in their entire existence. That is the agency for which was operating within our presence, and worthy of the social shame and stigma that other lawless, racially disparate, unconstitutionally acting organizations have acquired, like the Nazis or the Klan. And I say that as someone who's worked and served in the government for over 15 years, and that honor government service, particularly federal government service. Both of my parents are veterans. So this is not a broad slander of the individuals who work here. Again, the individuals who work in them are worthy of redemption. But the organizational structure itself, something that's new from 2003, has been weaponized and transformed in a way that I believe may be irredeemable. And we should look at what we did prior to that through the enforcement of immigration through the State Department and the FBI. The FBI looking at the criminal enforcement and the State Department looking at the civil enforcement or other different entities. But walking through Whipple, you see this industrial capacity that they've created under the pretext of enforcing immigration, but the industrial capacity to oppress large populations, citizens or not. And they've funded it to the tunes of over $100 billion. And it, for me, is untenable to when you see the industrial processing of people, and you understand that some of those folks, as we've seen in a lot of news footage and cameras, are folks who were just watching them, just following them, observing. That agency, there needs to be a serious look at them. But ultimately, outside of the legal and constitutional questions, there is a moral question that we must all raise around, if there's an organization operating, in a, again, I'm going to use a proper politically correct term, a racially disparate manner, targeting individuals. I mean, literally, I'm trying to be polite here, but calling individuals racist slurs as we've heard state Senate testimony in Congress around they're calling people racist slurs as they're arresting them. I don't know, 1 + 1 = 2, and they're doing this at a systemic level. This is not a one-off. This is not a bad apple, and I bring that up because again, when you're a part of it, when you hear folks outside of your holding cell joke about dragging in Don Lemon, hearing folks joke about that'll shut them up, and all laughing, right? Laughing at violations of the First Amendment, right? That experience will always stay with me. It's not. I operate in a privilege of being married to elected officials, having worked closely in and around elected officials. A lot of people who, like me, have been staff. They oftentimes moderate. They oftentimes tell folks, hey, you don't understand how the system works, right? And I think that when you truly understand how the system works and who it works for and who it doesn't work for, seeing this escalation of some of those disparities, and again, and understanding, hey, I'm privileged enough that, it's very difficult to, get away with abusing someone with my status, and recognizing that the terror visited upon my household, it's only a fraction of what our immigrant communities have had to bear. There are people who are living, in cellars underneath people's houses and pulling their kids out of school and afraid to report crimes. People who are being, abused by their employer, who we heard last night from Brian Wells, who represents the city of Minneapolis and their workforce, their, workers enforcement unit, leads to teams of attorneys. And he's like, we've seen a decrease of reports on workforce abuses. When you see people close their restaurants down and lose their businesses and their livelihoods, all because of the fear that the federal government has put into them, you recognize that this is something on a different order of magnitude that our state's ever. It's, some people have compared it to COVID, that ICE is a pandemic set upon our state. And again, having firsthand experience being processed through that Whipple building, it is, it's scary, it's cartoonish, and most importantly, has nothing to do with public safety, and it's wholly unnecessary. From the Whipple building, after being there as a holding cell, I saw some of the individuals who were arrested at Chorhan Cruz and Georgia Fort. We each were transported separately to the U.S. Marshals building downtown. Of course, these individuals, they threw me in the back of a car. They handcuffed me with my hands behind my back and almost popped my shoulder out. Again, completely unnecessary as I spoke to them. Like, I'm not in any threat in any way. And I could have always just turned myself in. Went to U.S. Marshal Service. Of course, these folks are from out of town. So they didn't even know the way to the building using Gmail, right? And so you're seeing this, and I'm seeing them trying to figure it all out. And so it was just a cartoonish level of incompetence for so much authority that they have over people's, lives. I'm like, my life's in the hands of folks who don't even know how to work Google Maps, right? Got to know the individual, and he actually was a 15-year FBI veteran. And by the time we were finished talking, he was all but ashamed of what are we doing here? He's like, well, I had nothing to do with going to your house. That wasn't my decision. I'm like, this is outrageous. The folks at the U.S. Marshal's Office are different than ICE and DHS. They really, serve the pleasure of the courts in many ways. And, they're just, doing their job, processing folks to get to court. And so there, I got in processed, had a good, talked with my lawyer at that point, as I had been requesting to do, and then we were scheduled to go before our first appearance.
So what do you think all of that kind of says about, like, they're all grouped together, right? It's just another day at the Whipple drinking coffee and whatever. But like you said, when you get them like one-on-one and you're like engaging them in conversation, how do you think that could be done, like, to appeal to the masses about some of these things that, you know, even a federal agent driving you to the U.S. Marshal Building, like, kind of a light bulb came on and was like, oh, like, how do you get through to everyone else?
Well, see, I just think that a lot of the direct action that protesters are taking are working, are showing safety in numbers, it's interesting because, you know, I've been working on immigration and public safety for pretty much my entire career, all the way back with the DREAM Act, where we helped give Minnesota state funds to help with undocumented immigrants' college tuition, driver's license for all bill. I was integral in helping the Real ID, having a Minnesota-based option for the Real ID. I think that was 2014, maybe. I worked on the LEAPS Act, which is around English language learning, and ensuring that parents and those kids weren't socially segregated within those schools. And I worked on public safety from 2018 to 2022, and into my current role, you know, where I'm employed at the Hennepin County Attorney's Office. I've been deeply involved in some of these issues, and I've seen the interest ebb and flow. And oftentimes it's not front page news. A lot of the work that our policymakers are engaging in ensuring that everyone's rights are protected. And what I recognize is in this moment, it is something that is unavoidable. Whether you're getting your hair cut, your barber's talking about it, whether you're at church, whether you're, I went to a part of my campaign going on a church tour, so I'm in a different church every Sunday usually, and each one is talking about this issue. I'm celebrating my friend's Rob's birthday, and folks on the party bus are talking about this issue that's going on. And I think it's important that folks emphasize agency. And I know I've talked about this a few times, where that these monstrous machineries of government are not created, by a bunch of army of robots. They're created by human beings who need to be invited, needs to be a permission structure created for them to opt out of being a part of. No one's drafted into ICE, right? They have the option to not participate. For me, I mean, that's part of where the masks come from. I think there is, the folks talk about some of the security concerns that some of these agents have. And I kind of say phooey, mainly because, there are special forces operators in like clandestine countries with, terrorists who are hell-bent on actually killing every American who don't wear masks, right?
Do you think that's because they believe in that mission? Do you think that the ICE or federal agents are more ashamed?
I think there's multiplicity of reasons why people participate in ICE. In the discussions that I had with some of the folks, I was talking about Liam, and I was explaining to them that, man, legal status. I was going through the facts of the case, and he was like, no, that wasn't the case. That wasn't true. We weren't using the 5-year-old as bait. And I'm like, have you not? Like, these are legal court cases. These are legal findings. Like, I'm not telling you this as my opinion or just from news report. These are evidence that has been brought before judges and have been adjudicated. He was wrongfully you're kidnapping a 5-year-old wrongfully. Like, what are we, a 2-year-old? There was, does your operation require you to throw flashbang grenades into the car of a bystander with a bunch of children? Like, that's what you're a part of. Well, you don't understand. This wasn't happening. Like, you guys have fights outside of Roosevelt High School. Well, we weren't out there, fighting. We were out there to pick someone up, and they wouldn't come out and this. And I'm like, brother, if you have a whole gang of law enforcement officers fighting with teenagers, you're doing something wrong. There was some operational planning portion that you got very wrong, brother. And again, there comes the silence, and the silence because of the shame, the recognition that, man, I'm not here to judge you. I hope that you judge you, though. You recognize you're making choices that staying with the status quo and going with your institutional inertia is not, you're not necessitated to do so. No, there's no gun to your head, brother. Tomorrow, you can just not come into work. And being presented with that option is something that, again, particularly some of the younger officers who were newer there, they had to sit with it. And I do think that is something, because you never do know who's involved to work for the federal government, something that we should be challenging and having conversations in and about with anyone around ICE is around particularly thinking through that agency piece. I do think sometimes when we talk about that organization, which for me as an institution is rotten to its core, but it's comprised of individuals. And part of the reasons why it's rotten to its core is because of the policies and procedures put in place by this recent administration. There's been a healthy discussion about sacred spaces by individuals on the far right. These spaces are super sacred, and we shouldn't arrest anyone who goes into them. And they do so not really cognizant, and this is part of the grace I give them, really cognizant that just last year in early 2025, the Trump administration rescinded a long-standing executive order. I think it was decades long, stretching back to Ronald Reagan, which prohibited ICE agents from entering sacred spaces, from going into hospitals and schools, from going into churches and hanging out in parking lots of churches. There is such utter disregard of the importance of our faith community, not by some individual organizers, but by the government itself. And I just remember a tradition of the right wing, of strong religious conservatives being most aghast by government intrusion into religious spaces. I remember the story of Jesus, right? Jesus didn't die by some, mob. It was a government that put him to death. And it's very disturbing to see people who I know and actually respect, who just happen to have a very different political persuasion on the right side of things, not having their priorities in order in terms of, concerns about people speaking loudly or disrupting business as usual in some circumstances, and then individuals who are, using physical force, who are dragging people out of their homes crying, who are murdering people in the streets for having a Second Amendment right. That misplacement of values is something that I was actually very happy to see being corrected following the murder of Alex Preddy, where I have to commend, it's better late than never, multiple Republican senators who did call for an investigation into that murder. I do think that that only occurs based upon the individuals who were active in the streets. The thing that turned the tide was a bunch of citizens, and almost because folks were so active and they were all well trained on being constitutional observers, everyone there was active. They were plugged in, they were informed, and they showed up and they recorded what they saw. That's what shook the conscience of the nation and caused for those individuals who are partisan in nature, who would much prefer to deny and discredit the actions of Alex Preddy. They couldn't ignore it. And so I'm reminded again of the importance of protesting, of showing up, of taking direct action, because it can and does transform the nation. And I've been, this month is Black History Month, and I've been reminding folks that there's a huge effort. They call it, attacking DEI, but it's a huge effort to hide our history, Black history. I mean, they tried to erase Jackie Robinson from the. They went too far. Like, okay, we'll put it back, right? They're over in Pennsylvania, in Mount Vernon, trying to remove the legacy of slavery and resistance. And I always remind folks why they do that. They do that because Black history is the best playbook. It's the best manual to defeating fascism. A lot of what I've been talking about when I discuss Black history is the difference between, or that we've seen fascism in our history. That fascism, I use that word, but it's a trigger word for some folks. But it's really just, rule by power, right? The rule of the strong versus the rule of the law, which is meant to be fairness and justice, right? Instead, it's just ruled by the whims of those who have the most power. Not necessarily the majority, but those who have the most power. And we've seen that animate itself, but in American history, oftentimes animated in terms of, sexual minorities, racial minorities, and oftentimes towards women. So I always say we're replacing racial fascism with partisan fascism. And the broader public is being shocked by what it means to have, federal forces in your neighborhood on a regular basis, breaking down doors, defying constitutional rights, assaulting people without need, silencing folks who are speaking out. And, this transformation, I always say, look to those in a lot of our movement, whether that be the suffrage movement, whether that be the American Indian liberation movement, whether that be the labor rights movement, or whether that be the civil rights movement. If you look in the threads of those resistance movements that have defeated the corners of fascism that existed in American society and helped to redeem America in many ways, you can find that playbook forward. And so I'm really inspired by our state because we did open that playbook. Minnesota has a rich tradition of labor activism, of civil rights activism, of abolitionists, when the abolitionist movement, all the way from the Dred Scott case. And we drew upon that, including our recent experience with the uprisings following George Floyd. All that organizing experience, some of my closest friends helped lead the nation in finding ways to fight back against what we've seen is authoritarianism. I used to say creeping authoritarianism, but when you murder somebody in the street and tell everyone to move along, don't ask any questions, I don't know what's more authoritarian than that.
As you've mentioned, okay, you're running for Senate in District 65?
Yes.
That's St. Paul?
Yes.
Yes. So with all of these different movements and things where it's the people kind of powering it, what would you tell the people who are skeptical of government as far as how elected officials can rise to the occasion?
Yes. Our majority leader, Erin Murphy, who also another mentor of mine, she's an incredible leader up at the Senate. She always says that politics and elections are how we got into this mess, and so it's the only way we're going to get out. One of my dear mentors and friend, Senator Bobby Joe Champion, the president of the Senate, always says, when good people disengage, we get bad government. I echo those statements often because I think there's a huge space, and you probably can see myself, I'm unfairly indicted because of it. There's a huge space for direct action, right? There's a huge space for mutual aid. There's a huge space for, getting together as a community, being an observer. I promote those actions all the time, shopping locally, spending money with immigrant communities. It's a huge space for that. But there's also a space for organizing electorally. There are billions of dollars that flow through our public coffers. There's an enormous amount of authority within a state and the state. And to not leverage the government, which is us, we're missing a major piece there. With that said, I can appreciate people's disenchantment with the government. I mean, fundamentally, we've been betrayed by our federal government. There are many moderate Democrats who've essentially betrayed the spirit of the struggle that we've been seeing everyday citizens risk everything for, and they're afraid to risk an election for it. They're afraid to do what's right, even when it's hard. We got, Congress people out here, when the polls say so, they're going to vote for, like, the Lincoln-Riley Act, right? I ain't going to name names, but those who know. And it's incredibly frustrating. It's incredibly disheartening to see these poll-tested politicians. And so what I tell folks is get involved, but get involved early. Get involved early. There are 4 elections every cycle in Minnesota. And a lot of the general public really only leans in on the last one. And I always say, well, every election's important, but the last one, you have the least power. You're one of, 10,000, 50,000, million, whatever it is, right? In that last election, the general election. And so the earlier you can get involved, the more actual leverage you have in determining what type of politician you actually want to see. A lot of times people show up in November and like, ooh, who selected these people? Well, selected these people? The people who showed up, right? And a government is I always kind of shied folks who feel like everyone should be following everything all the time. But I do think you, as I said, Senator Champion says, you get, when good people disengage, you get bad government. And so if you don't like what government is doing, you got to show up to let your voice be heard. And that's at the caucus level in February. I spent, all for the first month of the year, really, calling, chiding folks, running around, lecturing people to go to caucus. And, it's frustrating, partly because caucuses should be more open and more participatory, but also frustrating because some of the very folks who I'm going to see complain in November about, these milquetoast politicians are the same folks who didn't show up to caucus them out, right? And then you go to the convention level. Once you're elected as a delegate in the caucuses, you go to the convention, and there you select someone to endorse. The conventions are for Senator 65 will be March 29th at Humboldt High School. And again, I'm calling around to every delegate, letting them know, please come out. But I'm also inviting folks in to volunteer with my campaign for a strong show of force. And it's to help talk with delegates about why it's important that they are delegates and that they support someone who's willing to take risks, who are willing to stand on their values even when it's hard, when things get a little shaky, when your colleagues may not stand next to you, when if you want someone who's willing to be bold and support, stand up against government oppression, then part of that task of wanting to see that is showing up for these smaller elections. For folks who are interested in shaping the direction of their state, the earlier they get involved, the more influential they actually are. And I always say, do not leave the politics to the political insiders. And so I think folks are absolutely right about being concerned about our political class responding to a narrow set of interests and individuals. And I think their only antidote to that is not to tap out, but to tap in, to lean into further engagement. And so, yes, I find it, I find it frustrating as well, and that's part of the reason why I'm running. I like to think about it as an all hands on deck moment. And, whether you're really great at baking cookies, you bring those cookies to the protest, whether you're really good at, you're a big strategist for protests and you're on the front lines helping folks organize, or you're a restaurant like, Modern Times. You open up your restaurant for make it postmodern times and feed folks who are directly impacted. Or you're in office and you're able to open up those funding streams. We need all hands on deck. And I know what I do well. My passion and my skill for my entire career has been winning elections in passing legislation. And so I felt a responsibility that if I was literally being called to do so by our community leaders, then I had to step up.
Let's circle back a little bit to the Whipple and all of that chaos.
Okay.
I know you can't talk a lot about the ongoing case and all of those things, but what are the next steps? Don Lemon is in court today. I believe Nekima is as well. Without going into too much detail, what's the feeling in the group of people who you are named in this?
So I actually have not been in direct contact with folks. I think I may have talked with Nekima once, and then I had a short conversation with Jerome Treadwell, really just to let him know to keep his head up. He's a student currently. Who was he publicly stated was acting in the capacity of a producer, really the eyes on the ground for Don Lemon, during the events of that day. Again, just repeating the public comments that he's provided. I think as folks have seen, Nekima's defiant. She gonna be herself in many ways, but for many of those, what I've heard through the grapevine has just been traumatizing, right? A federal indictment ain't nothing to play around with. The federal conviction rate is nothing to sneeze at. And, certainly as, rattled my wife and family. The impulse I have, however, is to, accept it for what it is, to move forward with a belief of faith in the fact that your First Amendment rights still matter in the judiciary, and I also think it's just really important, as I said earlier, that folks don't see me and interact with me and feel as though, I'm never going to do that. I can never protest again. Because that's the intended effect of these, I want to call them persecutions, but prosecutions, right? The intended impact is to make people say, wow, they're breaking down Jamael? Man, I can't ever, I'm sorry, man, I'm not going to step up or go out or speak out. And so for me, I almost have to disassociate from what's the worst possible scenario and lean into what I know is right. And I really encourage other folks to do that as well. And so we've seen, Don Lemon in a courageous fashion continue to speak out about the ludicrousness of what's going on. Georgia Fort, in an incredible way, has continued to speak out as well. Nekima, Chantel, and others, even Jerome, and I think Trahan's calling to radio shows and whatnot. And so I am in solidarity with them. Again, from the moment Nekima was arrested, I've spoken out around this being a core First Amendment question. And the question is, do we still have a First Amendment? And that question doesn't get answered only by people in robes, but also by people in the streets. And I think it's important that we step up to answer that question, that hell yeah, we still have a First Amendment, and we're going to exercise it to its full extent.
So what is next for you personally in this process?
So what's next for me are twofold. So one, so I believe I've already done my arraignment, which is why I don't necessarily need to go. I retained a lawyer who was there that day, so we were able to process that arraignment. And so I think we're going to proceed to trial if there isn't a dismissal, which a lot of folks are advocating for, because I just encourage folks to go look at the complaint, and it should speak for itself in terms of it's. Again, I'm going to say animated content that I have much disagreement with. And for me, I'm going to continue to run my race, but I'm going to focus on my district as I run my race.